So this is weird. Never done a conference talk from my kitchen counter before. I hope that you're all well and safe and somewhere with a well-stocked pantry and plenty of toilet paper. Thank you for being part of Svelte Society Day 2020. Hopefully the first of many and hopefully the last one that we have to do remotely. My name's Rich. I am the original creator of Svelte, and today I am going to be trying to answer some of your frequently asked questions about Svelte. And the first one that makes sense to start with is, what is Svelte? I'm guessing that a lot of you, if you're watching this video, you already have some idea of what Svelte is. Maybe you're using Svelte, maybe you're on the Svelte core team, but there's probably also some people who maybe you're Svelte curious, or you're in lockdown and you're stuck at home and you literally have nothing better to do. Everyone is welcome. So I'm going to explain what it is. Svelte is a user interface framework, and by that I mean it serves a similar job to things like React and Vue, in that it lets you build a web application out of components. Components are the building blocks. They contain all of your markup, your styles, and your behaviors, and they're kind of like the Lego blocks that your application is built out of. The big difference between Svelte and those other frameworks that I mentioned is that it tries to do as much of the work at build time instead of that work happening in the browser. So whereas the traditional approach is that you would re-render a chunk of your application, which involves running a lot of code and then creating a lot of short-lived objects and functions and then handing that off to a thing that compares what you just generated with the previous version, which is quite a complex process. Svelte is designed in such a way that the browser doesn't have to do any of that work. It can do as little work as possible to keep the page in sync with the state of your application. And so the result is, firstly, you get to write a lot less code, because we're aggressively transforming the code that you wrote into the code that actually runs. It means that we have fewer constraints about how your code looks in the first place. We get better performance because a lot of that work is happening at build time instead of it having to happen in the browser, which means that you can do more ambitious things with your applications, or it means that you can serve lower powered devices like smartwatches and smart TVs and things like that. And it also means that you get smaller applications typically, so you get a better lighthouse score. I've done conference talks diving into all of these things in greater detail, so if you're interested in learning more about what it is and how it does what it does, then have a look at those. I have had a haircut since those videos. Thank you for noticing. The next question we get quite a lot is, how can I learn Svelte? We recommend that you start with the official tutorial. Svelte.dev/tutorial has an interactive walkthrough that covers basically the entirety of every aspect of how you would write a component. That said, if you prefer to learn by watching videos, then there are some options available. There's the Egghead collection Up and Running with Svelte 3 by Tomasz. And on Udemy, there's Svelte.js The Complete Guide by Maximilian. I would be remiss if I didn't also mention that I will be doing a front-end masters workshop in June, which is quite soon, and I should probably start writing it. If you prefer your learnings in book form, then there is going to be a book out later this year called Svelte and Sapper in Action by Mark Volkmann, which has a really interesting choice of cover artwork. I've had a sneak preview of this book and it looks really good and comprehensive, so keep an eye out for that. Obviously, the best way to learn any technology is just go ahead and build stuff with it, and then as you get stuck, figure out how to ask the right questions. All right, another question that we get very often, is the site down? No, it's probably not down. It's probably just that you can't access sites with a .dev TLD. For some reason, this happens to a lot of people who use Macs, and the way that you fix it is you just open the terminal and type rm/etc/resolver/dev. You might need to stick a sudo in front of that, and that solves it for most people. How can I get my editor to understand Svelte files? Okay, so Svelte components are written into files with a .svelte extension, and by default that doesn't mean anything to a text editor. But every editor lets you alias extensions to something else. For example, in VS Code you can edit the files.association settings and you can tell it that a Svelte file is basically like an HTML file, which it is. And that gives you good enough syntax highlighting to work with. But you can do even better than that if you're using VS Code, and I recommend VS Code, it's an excellent editor. Then you can install the Svelte extension by James Birtles, and that gives you better syntax highlighting and autocomplete and various bits of linting and what have you. So that is the best way to get your editor up and running with Svelte files. Next question, is there a UI component library for Svelte? Yes, there are. There's a whole bunch of them. Go to the Svelte community site and you'll see implementations of Material UI, Bulma, IBM's Carbon design system. I don't personally use component libraries for the same reason that I don't buy pasta sauce in jars. I like making things from scratch. I like being as close to the platform as possible and kind of refining my process over time. And I like to create something slightly unique each time. But I recognize that a lot of you work in teams where it makes more sense not to keep reinventing the wheel. So check out those libraries and let us know which ones you like. Will there ever be an official router? We get asked this a lot. There are a lot of different routers, or routers if you're an American. 19 on the Svelte community site, if you don't include framework agnostic routers like Page.js. And this makes people really unhappy, which I understand. Like if I walk into the pharmacy and there's 19 different kinds of shampoo, I'm very unhappy. I want two kinds. I want the cheap kind and the good kind. And ideally, I want them to be the same kind. Vue is a project that gets this right. There is an official Vue router, and even though Vue itself has no opinions about routing, Vue router is like the obvious answer to the question, how do you do routing in Vue? And we don't have an answer to that question. And the reason for that is that different people have different opinions about the right way to solve this problem. It's a pretty complex subject with a lot of subtle things that can go wrong. So I personally have been hesitant to say this is the way that you do routing in Svelte apps. But having said that, I totally sympathize with people who ask that question, and I am kind of coming around to the view that we really should have an official router. We can't ignore the fact that so many people have asked this question. So I'm not making any promises, but watch this space. All right, TypeScript. Yeah, turns out a lot of you really like TypeScript. And I get it, I really like TypeScript too. Svelte is written in TypeScript. I just find it incredible that 3 years ago, no one really cared. And then now it's table stakes. People expect to be able to use TypeScript in their projects. But right now you can't really use TypeScript inside your Svelte components. And we're talking about a few different things when we say that. We want to be able to use TypeScript inside our script tags. We want type checking inside our markup. And we want that type checking to include the props that a component exports. If you import a foo component and instantiate it, then as you type the letter B, you want the bar that the foo component exports to pop up, and then if you give it a value that is the wrong type, then you want TypeScript to be able to warn you about that. And right now that's not possible, but progress is happening. There is a new language tools repository in the Svelte organization, which is going to form the foundation of these efforts. Huge thanks to Auta from the TypeScript team, who has led the charge on like figuring out how to do all this and on setting up that repo. And thanks also to James Birtles, who created that VS Code extension that included the original Svelte language server, which is going to form the foundation for a lot of this stuff. Also, I want to share this experimental type checker from Half Nelson, who's the brains behind Svelte Native, which lets you write iOS and Android apps using Svelte. The type checker takes your Svelte components, turns them into JSX, and then runs the TSX type checker on them. And in that way, you can get type checked Svelte components. Still experimental, but really exciting. So there is work happening in this space, and I feel pretty confident that we'll have some good news on this front over the next few months. Okay, another question that we get a lot is, does Svelte scale? And it's a question that I'm always kind of happy to hear, because when someone asks this question, it shows that they've really kind of understood what Svelte is doing and the trade-offs that are involved in the approach. what it's basically asking is, yes, Svelte apps start out smaller because they don't have the big kind of framework runtime that you get normally, but the incremental cost of a component is higher. And what I mean by that is this: like, if you imagine like your x-axis on a chart is the number of components in your application, and the y-axis is the byte size of that app, then Svelte will start pretty low and then it'll sort of increase like that. Whereas if you had a more traditional framework, maybe it would start higher, but the incremental cost is lower, like the additional bytes per component is lower. So at a certain point you hit an inflection point where your app is going to be larger because you built it with Svelte than if you had built it with another framework, in theory. And so how do we answer the question of whether you can therefore use Svelte for large applications? And there's a few ways that we can answer this. First of all, the incremental cost actually isn't that high. It is certainly higher than it is with other components, but the code that Svelte generates is designed to minify really well. And so, the only thing that matters is actually where that inflection point is. And in practice, we've found that it's quite hard to reach. It depends obviously on which framework you're using. If you're using Preact, then the inflection point will come sooner than if you're using React. But it's also going to depend on the kinds of components that you're building and how complex they are. But it's going to be somewhere between 5 components and 1,000 components. We don't really know. But this graph is too simple. Total app size isn't the thing that matters. What matters is how much JavaScript you have to load to get the application interactive in the first place. And because of code splitting, which we're all doing, right? You're doing code splitting, right? It means that that amount is going to be fairly minimal in a Svelte application. Traditionally, even the smallest initial JavaScript chunk has to include an entire framework. So the initial chunk is generally going to be larger with a traditional framework than it will be in a Svelte application. And once you've got the initial app loaded, then you can load later chunks lazily, so that by the time the user clicks on a link to navigate to another part of your application, you've already preloaded the JavaScript for that part of the app. So size matters less for the subsequent chunks. So the only thing that really matters is the initial chunk, and it's really hard to create something that is so complex with Svelte that it would be larger than it would with a traditional framework. Finally, we're a compiler, right? Which means that if it does become a problem, we can just adopt a different technique. We could output JSX instead, if that turned out to be the smaller way to build an application. Or we could even do something like what happens inside Ember, which is they generate this obscure bytecode and then run it through a virtual machine. These options exist because Svelte is a compiler, because Svelte components are designed in a way that can be statically analyzed and can be output into different formats. So you already know that we can turn Svelte into JSX because we're using it in Svelte type checker, for example. But this is all a little bit academic. The reason that we're not doing any of this stuff is because in practice we just haven't found that to be a problem yet. If it does, we'll change our stance. But for now, yes, Svelte does scale. Okay, another question that we get a lot. What is the recommended way to test components? Okay, so I have a terrible admission. I don't know what the recommended way to test components is because I don't write tests for my components. Maybe that's just the kind of applications that I'm building. Seems a little bit superfluous, but I tend to see tests that assert things like if you have a component that renders a div and then you put that component on the page will have a div. And I'm being slightly facetious, but a lot of it is literally like that. And what is the point? It's just duplicating what's already in Svelte's own test suite. So I'm not sure that there is much of a value to those kind of tests. Having said that, I do understand that wiser and more experienced people than me profoundly disagree with that statement, and so I will probably reverse my opinions at some point in the future. But in the meantime, what I'll do is I'll point you towards a couple of libraries that can make testing easier. There's a new one by Nathan Cahill called Dainty, at least I think that's how you pronounce it. And then there's also Svelte Testing Library, which is part of the Kent C. Dodds empire. So you have options. Another good question is, how do you structure larger projects in Svelte? So Svelte is just a UI library. It's like React and Vue in that it doesn't really contain any opinions about how to do anything other than components. But there's a lot more to building an app than just components. You got to think about where your data comes from, how you structure your files in your project, all of those sorts of things. And a couple of years ago, I was building applications at work, and I found myself getting frustrated at having to solve the same problems over and over again, like how to handle routing without duplicating code between server and client, and all of that other stuff. And so I created Sapper, which is an opinionated layer on top of Svelte that makes all of those decisions for you. Sapper stands for Svelte App Maker, and it's kind of a meta framework that sits on top of Svelte, and it gives you server-side rendering, code splitting, routing, etc., etc., etc. And I've used it for some pretty large apps at my job at the New York Times that have to handle huge amounts of data, but I can't really talk about those apps publicly. But having talked about Sapper, we do often get questions like, what is the future of Sapper? And that question comes in two variants. Number one, is Sapper dead? There haven't been any updates for a while. And number two, what's on the roadmap? And we'll do the roadmap first. So I think it would be cool if we had more control over the output. Currently, you have a choice between building a node server and doing an export of static HTML files a la Gatsby. It'd be great if that choice wasn't all or nothing, right? In many apps, you will have some pages that are completely static and some that need to be generated per request. And it'd be great if you could mix and match between those in the same application. Good if we could take advantage of things like serverless platforms and Cloudflare workers and stuff like that. Maybe we could even output Electron apps. There are some pages in a Svelte app that don't involve any JavaScript on the client side at all. It would be good if Sapper could just give you the HTML and then only serve enough JavaScript to allow you to navigate to the next page, rather than replacing the server render markup with the client side equivalent. So yeah, there's a few different ideas about how to control the output that we want to solve. Internationalization is another big one. This is a really hard problem to solve in userland, and a lot of internationalization solutions have quite a lot of overhead, it turns out. So this feels like a place where if you apply a compiler-centric mindset, you could do some really interesting stuff. SPA mode is a commonly requested feature for Sapper. By that, what I mean is a lot of people just want to have a single page app. They don't want the server-side rendering feature of Svelte. They just want to have an application that runs on top of an app shell. And Sapper could do that really easily. So that's something that we'll probably do. An easier way of authenticating users, rather than having to like manage sessions yourself and everything that's involved with that, which is really hard. Like, no one wants to deal with OAuth and stuff like that. It would be good if Sapper had a really good canonical way to do authentication. And obviously a bunch of performance improvements and bug fixes, particularly around exporting. So the roadmap has lots on it. But the other question, is Sapper dead? No, it's not dead, but I'll admit it's not in great health either. And that is entirely my bad. I had to take a break from open source at the start of this year, and just as I was about to get back into it, the pandemic happened, and so now I'm working long hours. I don't really have time for open source right now, and I'm just bad at delegating and letting other people take ownership of projects like Sapper, and I need to get better at that. Having said that, I still really believe in the project. I think it's a really nice way to build apps, and I think it has a potential to become incredibly powerful. I still use it whenever I need to build an app. And I think it's really valuable to have an officially supported app framework, not least because it helps shape the development of the underlying component framework. Svelte 3 is, it owes a large part of its design to the lessons that we learned from using Sapper with Svelte 2. So it's definitely not dead, but it does need some love, I will admit. If you are sick of waiting for a new Sapper release, then you can check out this new project called Routify by Jacob Rosenberg and friends. Similar sort of project to Sapper, and I haven't used it yet, but I've poked around the documentation and it looks really cool, so check that out. Next question, how do you do server-side rendering with Svelte? So the easiest way is to use Sapper, but then if you do that, you have to accept all of Sapper's opinions about how to build the rest of your application. So here's a quick demo showing how you could put it together yourself. First, we're going to import the compiler. Then we're going to give it some component source code and log out the result. And you'll see that this code is designed to run in the browser. This just gives you a JavaScript class that you can instantiate and mount to the DOM. If you change the generate option to SSR, it will instead output code that is designed to run on the server. And we can import the resulting module and generate HTML with it. And this lets you do some really custom stuff. So for example, at the New York Times, we have a number of pages showing data about the coronavirus pandemic. For example, this chart shows the rate of change of cases in the US. And the data that's being used to build this chart is coming from a rather large JSON file. Now, traditionally, the way that you would make a chart like this is you would load some JavaScript, you would load a charting library like D3, you would fetch the JSON file with Ajax, and then you would render the chart. But then, you'd be staring at a blank space for quite a while. Instead, what we do is render this chart at build time with Svelte, meaning that we just have to serve a tiny blob of HTML and SVG, no JavaScript. Now, believe it or not, this is all powered by a Google Doc. It turns out to be a really great way to manage a project like this. And the Svelte components are configured with snippets of a language called ArchieML. ArchieML is named after its creator, Archie Say, who's a former Olympic figure skater and current director of graphics at the New York Times. Although to New Yorkers, he's better known as the guy from the choking poster, which is not a joke. It's him. SNL did a sketch about it. Now, this static true property in the ArchieML tells the system not to bother with client-side JavaScript for this component because it doesn't need any. It's a completely static component. But then further down the page, we have a more detailed look at the data. And again, this component is server rendered because that's the best way to serve search engines, and it makes sure that there's something for people to look at while JavaScript is loading, or if JavaScript fails to load. But this component is also interactive. You can drill down and search. So for example, if you want to know what's happening in Garvin County, Oklahoma, which is the home of Joe Exotic's Tiger Zoo, then you can. This time the ArchieML doesn't have static true, so client-side JS is getting generated, and the system loads it along with the data that's going to power that component and then hydrates the server-rendered markup into an interactive application as soon as the page loads. So we kind of get the best of all possible worlds. We have all of the interactivity we want, but we have a lean, fast page load, and we don't have a really complex development experience. All of this stuff just happens automatically. So I asked people on Twitter for their questions, and here's one I got from Kevin. Is a goal of Svelte to break the complexity bubble in the tech industry that comes with needing to learn a framework with a lot of concepts to do front-end development? So I started Svelte for myself. It's the framework that I wanted to exist in the world. But I think those of us working on these kinds of tools have an opportunity to help democratize the process of building stuff for the web. It's really cool that companies like Apple and Spotify are using Svelte, but I get far more joy from discovering that someone who's new to development has decided to pick up Svelte and is building things that they didn't think that they would be able to build. Discovering that they can build web applications too. So yeah, I guess that is a goal of Svelte. Can I give you money? We get this question quite a lot, and it is really heartwarming, but it's always a bit of a difficult topic. None of us who work on the project do so for any reason other than that we want to. And there's always a fear that getting money involved in an open source project could have a weird effect on our personal incentives and motivation for working on the project. And it could also change the project's priorities in a way that maybe isn't best for the community. And ultimately what we lack is time, and more money wouldn't fix that. So we've always kind of said no, thank you for offering us money, but we don't really have a way to accept it, and we don't know what we would do with it if we did. Having said that, any open source project above a certain size, it does need to find a way to become sustainable. And I think Svelte is probably approaching that point. And there are costs associated with running an open source project like this. I pay for the hosting of svelte.dev, for example, and I'm currently several $100s out of pocket. So we might well start an open collective just so that we're not actually losing money by building this thing. We'll see. Okay, this question is brilliant. It's not a frequently asked question, but it was an asked question. You presumably spent a considerable amount of time and energy on building Svelte because you thought that there must be an alternative to virtual DOM. Are there any other things in computers or society where you think we are trapped in a local maximum for years or decades? That question's from Roman. And it's a great question. And the answer is yes. I'll take computers first. So the web itself is a local maximum. It's an incredible platform, but it's not the best that it could be. It's accumulated a lot of cruft over the years. This thing that was originally designed for hypertext delivery is now the world's biggest distribution platform for rich interactive applications, and it was never designed for that. And if we were to design the web today for the things that we use it for today, it would probably look very different. So yeah, the web is a local maximum. I think UI design is stuck in a local maximum. I often like to look at what interaction designers come up with for film and TV, right? When I'm using a computer or a phone, I want to feel like Dolores in Westworld, and at the moment I don't. I feel frustrated. The way that we develop software is definitely at a local maximum. Why are we using CLIs and text editors? You could invent some reasons and they might even sound convincing, but ultimately those reasons are not good. The reason is that it's just how we've always done things, and it's easier than to carry on doing things that way than it is to change. So yeah, once you get into the habit of thinking in terms of local maxima, you start seeing them everywhere, and they definitely exist in society as well. Capitalism is a local maximum. It's really great for solving certain problems, but at the risk of outing myself as an old school Marxist, I think we're at the point where it's probably creating more problems than it solves. The entire structure of our society is going to have to be rethought if we're going to make it through this century. Like the fact that we use GDP as a measure of human progress is a local maximum. It's allowed policymakers to ignore widening inequality for the last several decades. I could do a half-hour talk just on this, but I'll get myself in trouble if I do. So I'm just going to leave you with this thought. If you're at a local maximum and you want to get to a higher point that you can't yet see because you haven't explored that territory, then you have to kind of dip down into the valley in order to get there, and that takes faith. So the comfortable option is always going to be to stay put wherever you happen to be. All right, final question. Is Svelte ready for prime time? Nathan says, please kill this comment. Oh, Svelte, yeah, you wouldn't use that for any serious commercial project. And I totally get this sentiment. If you're an engineering manager and you're trying to choose a technology with a track record that you're still going to be able to hire for 2 years down the line, then it makes total sense to use something like React rather than a relatively unproven framework like Svelte. Even if you have people who you work with who really want to use this technology and are familiar with it. I would love to kill that comment, but it's not in my power, and it's not in the power of anyone on the core team. Ultimately, that is all down to you fine people. That's all we have time for. Thank you to everyone who submitted questions. Sorry to those of you who I haven't been able to respond to. I'll try and do so individually soon. I hope you enjoy the rest of the day. Stay safe.